I had a very interesting discussion with the interview online about individual assessment. And that was so interesting and so productive that I thought I'd revisit some of that issue, mainly because there are many ins and outs to your data and the access that researchers have to it and the things that researchers do with that data. So, any of you participating in a study on campus where, as part of the consent process, they said, well, can we have access to your geolocation on your phone? If you know of, if you read the consent, maybe. No. Well, those types of studies are ongoing. And you need to think a little bit about what you do when you sign that consent as to what they're doing with the data. Generally speaking, in psychology, network models are very interesting. That is, we want to study systems of people. And so what they're doing with that geolocation data is, if you turn on the data, it's going, or if you're even only accessing the web when you're at the establishment, they're keeping track of when you are where you are. So if, for example, this happens to be at an eating establishment, or because we were illegal, by recording several people, they can have access to who you are with. And they also know that when you're using the phone, you can see who your friends are. And some of the questions they ask are you likely to stay out late? If everybody else has kind of gone home, midterms are coming up, I gotta leave. And you look on your phone and, well, actually my friend is two establishments down the road here. I can go and party with them. They also match up the geolocation data with other outlets, and they cross-reference this with other establishments. So Puruposive, for example, regularly gets into trouble for serving underage. We can study how many people are frequenting that establishment, when they frequent it, and what the patterns of people doing that. And this is somewhat disturbing to people because, all of a sudden, initially, well, it's my geolocation data, that's fine. Now, all of a sudden, we are looking at who you are, who your friends are, when you meet with your friends, what you're doing when you're with your friends, and then matching that up with other behavior. It's something, and that's a little bit difficult because as a researcher, when you do consent, you don't want to say, and here are all the ways we're going to use your data. Hey, maybe some of this is not yet known. They'll be on William Whewell's inductive arm. They got a lot of data that nobody in science has ever looked at and looking at novel associations. And B, if you tell them, well, really, this is about what you're doing and your propensity to engage for several of your illegal behaviors because you're underpaid, that's going to contaminate the results if people know, well, I'm not, if I'm going to have to turn off my data. These data also get matched up with latitude and longitude on Google Earth and with the census data. The University of Missouri is a census repository. So in addition to all of that, we can get information on how dense the population is, where your residence hall is, and so forth. Legally speaking, by the way, all of the information in the student directory is not subject to human subjects' consent. It's considered publicly available information. This also counts for the directory, the student directory of, the registrar's directory when classes meet. It's public domain, everybody can use it. You can also match this up with other repositories out there that relate to other variables you're interested in. So if you like, you can log on to SpotCrime just for the heck of it. I did a search of crimes that are happening in my local neighborhood. So you can see, over a particular time period, we have a number of thefts going on. We have a number of other things that are not yet coded. We have one arrest down here. And further, you can click on any of these offenses and then go and get more information as to what is exactly going on. So, geolocation, again, with your phone or other aspects of what you're looking at. So if you're living on campus in a relatively high crime area, well, first of all, it's kind of good to know that. And secondly, you are at differential risk for some things than if you live out where in terms of anonymous things, it's possible to go in. I hope this works. I can put it in. You now have a list of all the sex offenders who are currently living here. And yes, they are required to be a certain distance away from schools and so forth. Each of these yellow dots represents a sex offender. So you can go down and say, who is the sex offender? What is the particular offense? And if you want, you can then go in and get even more data on this person. So you can search the directory. And this one was Jerry Wilcox. It is. So we can actually go and get a picture of this person. It's publicly, I love the eyebrows, even with masks, to get a few eyebrows. This person is compliant. Some of the people in the map are not compliant. Some of the offenders here are sex offenders that are registered, but they're out of state. So we want to track on what the offense is or whether they are compliant or not compliant. You can play your own games, enter your own address in, and find exactly where your sex offenders are. Well, this is a data source. You can go in and you can visually then code by race. You can code a approximate age, kind of, sort of. You can also go in and find other registries that have other information about the person's to when the conviction happened and what the resolution is. It's all data. So you can cross-match that with like residences where college students are likely to live and answer some questions about that. So now let's play the other skeptical game. Is this a good thing or a bad thing? Well, yes, currently in a lot of our work, public policy, there was a massive outcry for information about sex offenders. Megan's Law being an example of one of them, that if there is someone who is a child molester and they are living in your apartment complex, you might want to know about that. That might make you a little bit safer. However, to play a little bit the devil's advocate, let's think a little bit about exactly who a sex offender is. There are young men at various universities, like at Penn State. There's a tradition called the Mifflin Hall streak, where the gentlemen opt to disrobe and run through campus naked. That's a sex offense. That gets you into the registry. That follows you. Now, this is indecent exposure. Does that deserve to follow these people forever? So if someone was streaking in Penn State and they come to Missouri, they're going to show up as a yellow dot here as an out-of-state sex offender. What types of things happen to known sex offenders? Well, they ain't pretty. And these people, in terms of, to turn this back to psychological research, they do not have a right to privacy, and they do not have a say in how this data gets used. A few other things. You might think, well, sometimes people speed a little bit. Sometimes heaven forfend, you get arrested for alcohol intoxication. Do you have a right to have that information be private? I'm not surprised that the answer is no. You have a DUI, and a qualified researcher can solicit that information from the state. They will get when the DUI happened, what alcohol level for the DUI, what the resolution was, and your current address, and your address at the time the DUI happened. Well, that's very interesting in terms of reducing the public problem of intoxicated driving. Incidentally, folks, we generally don't use DUI convictions in research and alcohol problems because very often those arrests are so differential as a function of race. Black people do get pulled over more. Black people tend not to have the money required to hire a really good lawyer to defend your case. Make an appeal to have this expunged from the record. So they show up in the record law. Records of the blood alcohol level, if the person consents to that, that's important. Well, if you are interested in the community, you can also come into the Boone County community and you can access the Lexis Nexus. Unfortunately, Boone County doesn't subscribe to that, so I can put in, say, my old stomping ground. Minneapolis. And Minneapolis is a busy place, a lot of theft going on, and arson and types of things like that. Well, again, you can come in and you can download that data and you can analyze it. That's also going to give you latitude and longitude. So it is informative. And those are a rich source of information. Well, the book talks an awful lot about, oh, we need open science. We need to have these data sets out in the public so other researchers can fight the good fight and think if this analysis is working or not. That's soft. If you have a record in there and that says the sex, the address, other information about crime, maybe, other information about who your neighbors are, because that's also available. I can go into real estate things or Google Earth, and I can click on your residence and look at it from above. At some point, you have lost anonymity. This comes to us in spades when we're analyzing even large samples of the Mizzou population. You don't have the person's name, but you've winnowed it down so darn much that, in terms of the tick boxes, that person becomes readily identifiable. If you're asking something sensitive, like, have you suffered sexual abuse as a youngster? Have you engaged in regrettable sex? You really want, in terms of beneficence and maintaining respect for people, you cannot release that data set out except in aggregate form. We don't tend to think about all of the ways that our individual data is being mined. So yes, it's the case that I can't come in and look at your Facebook analytics. Advertisers can. So if you're kind of confused about the fact that you went to visit your parents and all of a sudden now you're seeing ads for the brand of toothpaste that your mom buys, how did that happen? Well, I'll tell you a few things. One, your phone is not recording you. You kind of prove that is not the case. But what they do is they keep track of your location. And they keep track of other people's whose locations are there. And if you signed off on the discount card deals at places like Hy-Vee and Sam's Club and so forth, you consented your rights to identification. So the reason you're getting ads for god-awful Arm & Hammer baking geolocated in the same location as they, and that both you and your mom tend to shop at, say, Hy-Vee. Well, release of that data is not entirely covered by the subjects. Advertisers can sell one. It was very interesting, by the way, to listen committee about Facebook, because they said, well, the reaction from Mr. Zuckerberg was, oh, we would never ever promote hate. As a matter of fact, our advertisers tell us that we shouldn't, have their ads appear next to hate speech. No, yeah, but to stop the steal, folks, we're an advertiser. A lot of the political organizations, they're the advertisers. Most advertisers have access to the data. I get an awful lot of Republican stuff in my Facebook feed when I'm logged onto it. The reason for that is anytime something comes up, I click on it. Like, take this survey, I'll just click on it. I won't fill it out. Because that's what's called, the term of art is an impression. You clicked on it, you looked at it, and whoever's advertising has to pay a little bit of money. Josh Hawley's fundraiser thing, I will happily click on it. Our privacy is not what we think it is, and it's a very concerning thing. With respect to the material of this class, at what point is accessing the data ethical? So if an advertiser makes their money, their data set available to you for secondary analysis, should you necessarily be using it? And what are the ethical consequences of it? It was a great discussion. I don't know if any of you have thoughts on that. And there was yet another person who talked to me and said, don't write things on the blackboard, just add them to the end of the PowerPoint. And then when you save the PowerPoint, we can look at it and we'll have to reconstruct it from our notes. So I intend to do that in the future. But any thoughts? Yeah.
It's kind of unrelated, but and with journalism, there's this movement called Break to Forget, where certain journalistic institutions will hold on to records of people who say like it's a kind of crime in the past, and there's this whole discussion going on about how long do we hold on to it, because it's like, let's say someone, the indecent exposure thing, like yes, it'll be a matter of public record, but being in the newspaper is also another thing.
Yes, it's true.
So it's kind of like the question of like, well, we'll keep it in there, but we'll keep the information in there, like you put this on someone for so long, or
We have the right to have it expunged. I mean, we do have some formal rights for some offenses to have it expunged. The European Union is a bit ahead of us in that regard. The sad story there is the IBM Corporation was very complicit in the Nazi program of identifying where people lived and what their characteristics were. We used to have IBM computer codes. There were little tick marks for all these characteristics. And the fact that they were able to have computers enabled them to identify people that was unforeseen in previous work. So for that reason, they're very, very cautious about these things. In the US, not so much. So, personal story, my brother-in-law played for a football team in college, and there was somebody named Boone that he was. For that reason, he's kind of a minor celebrity at family get-togethers. I think he kind of enjoys talking to me because I'm never going to talk about football. But he was quite upset when he was looking at Google Earth and saw that the Google Earth picture of him revealed a picture of him throwing the football around with his boys in the front yard. Well, that automatically identifies the kids, and he just didn't like that. So he went through the process, he's also a lawyer, to have that video expunged, blurred over. But in the European Union, all of this is automatically anonymized. So if you say, Google my old apartment in Berlin, and you want the street view, all of the license plate numbers will be blurred out. All of the faces of people will be blurred out. This is only incompletely done in Google Earth in the United States. I was happy to notice that some of the Google Earth walking videos of places like Penn State and so forth did have the faces blurred out. But there's numerous examples. Interestingly enough, Google Earth has also identified people who are being trafficked. Quite incidentally, they've also identified crimes being committed quite incidentally. And yes, it's kind of good to have crime identified, but what rights do you have? What reasonable expectations of privacy do you have? It's a big issue. And as you mentioned, the issue of your name in the record. In the European Union, you can produce an appeal and say, I want to have this record expunged from the internet. But in the US, not so much, at least to my understanding, perhaps it's changed. But it's all data. And given that privilege and access to rights and actions are different for different members of our society, that raises some ethical issues. It also raises some limitations to analysis of the data. Right, so that's available in the PowerPoint, should you want to follow up on that, or draw your own crime maps for where you are. There is a Clery report for the campus, which records incidents, at least at MU. It's a little bit hard to get to. You can find it, you have to dig a little bit. And secondly, it does not provide the level of granularity of exactly where, how, and when this was done. But they are required to. So there's that. Oh, so I'm a little bit ahead. You may have noticed of the calendar and the schedule. I'm trying to do some activities. Now, this can take a number of ways, and this is your class, and we're here to give you what you need and why. Firing up R, doing an analysis, getting your picture back, that's all kind of good. I'm kind of thinking you need possibly to look at how to make bar charts by groups like sex or age or experimental versus control. It's also the case if you're going out, some of you next semester, you're going to be collecting data. So we can also do an activity where you might use, say, Google Forms to make yourself a little survey. Do that design and collect that data. That's also an option. We can kind of walk you through how that goes. Do you have preferences, or are there things that you would find? Otherwise, I'll just make stuff up.
Google Forms.
Google Forms is good. Okay. Let's try on that for Friday. I'd like to spend a little bit of time continuing where we were. Continuing where we were in the 7th. Well, I think. We talked about this. So, convenience sampling, I think I did talk about. That's just basically grabbing anyone who's available. If you're talking about journalism, that's the Mott's interview, a somewhat gender biased term, man on the street interview. I guess it's now the Potts interview, person on the street. You can't really know much about it. It provides you with some information. At least in journalism, there's somebody out there walking around or in a wheelchair who has the given opinion, but it doesn't give you information about the frequency data that you need in order to come to some conclusions. That kind of is an institutionalized way of looking at the present bias. That, here's this person walking down the street, I assess them. And if you are looking at self-selection issues, maybe the problem with that is only the people who are going to fill out your survey are going to be the ones who tell you things. So in this particular situation, we have some people who say, oh no, that's terrible luck. Do we have any confidence that really that's going to be the proportion of people who think that walking under a ladder is bad luck? Because only people kind of see this and go, yeah, I'd like to respond to that and then give you an answer to it. These types of convenience surveys happen all the time. They do not happen out of the blue, given the cautions that I raised earlier in lecture. That, for example, if you log on to the MSN network, there's a little quiz saying, what do you think about XXX? Well, you're voluntarily giving information to them that are related to things like your overall demographic profile. Do you remember the Cambridge Analytica scandal? No. Cambridge Analytica scandal was a finding that by hoovering up all of the data about people, you can make conclusions that are actually statistically quite impressive. So in the early days of it, before I realized how terrible this was, they had like 20 questions. And as you answered them, it then came back with a profile that said, this is the odds that you are likely a Republican. These are the odds that you are likely heterosexual. These are the odds about what your income range is. And these are all based on normative response to these rather large data sets that exist out there. It's quite a scandal. The problem with the Cambridge Analytica scandal was that this information was then piped to presidential campaigns so that they could target people who would be most likely to respond to them. And yes, the Russians were involved in this. As a little old person bit of advice, when the current president called Vladimir Putin a murderer, it wasn't that he was just kind of cranky that morning. Vladimir Putin's ID was found in East German prisons. And the East German prisons were violent and terrible places. A friend of mine was in the tiger cage for a year in solitary confinement. The tiger cage is not something, you might think that John McCain spent years at the Hanoi Hilton in tiger cages and that was terrible. It wasn't the invention of evil Vietnamese people. The tiger cage existed before then and was invented by the Russians. Again, a funneling of these large blocks of data out here for ends that we don't necessarily. So how are we going to get a representative sample? The easiest thing to understand, and the thing that you probably encountered, that you did encounter in your earlier statistics work, is we want to do a random sample. Well, how do you get a random sample? A little bit of vocabulary here. I think I can edit this as a matter of fact. This involves something called a sampling frame. A sampling frame is some data set that tells you the known characteristics of the population. So if you wish to sample Missouri residents, you can go over to Ellis Library and get information about the density of people living in Missouri, broken out by the average income, average education level, sex composition, proportion of people having a high school degree, and so forth. Other sampling frames exist out there as well. So if, for example, you are interested in studying women's reproductive rights, you can access some public domain, and they'll give you an Excel spreadsheet, a rating by county and broken up in some of the larger counties into subunits of the women who choose to terminate their pregnancies, how far along they were in the pregnancy, what the method of terminating the pregnancy was, where they went to have the pregnancy terminated. And the base rate per 1,000 population of women who choose to terminate pregnancies. If you get into that data, it's really quite interesting because it shows quite clearly that access to women's reproductive health is very strongly determined by the availability of healthcare in that part of the state. So women in rural parts of Missouri do not have abortions to the degree that women who live in larger metropolitan areas. And we can match that data up with the other data set that we have here. So once you have a sampling frame, you can then come in and say, well, inside that sampling frame, I'm just going to contact people in a fashion that I hope, at least in terms of initial contact gives me an equal chance of everybody in the population. And the book, by the way, makes a great deal of using random numbers. We don't do it that way anymore. Random number tables. Generally speaking, you can use Excel's random number generator and get people, assign people to conditions should you want, or assign people to whether they are assessed or not. Here's some more vocabulary. So the second big issue is to talk about probability sampling. So inside of probability sampling, I can do systematic sampling. That is, I can say, I'm going to solicit individuals to participate until I reach my quota. So if I'm doing a study, for example, of University of Missouri students, I might say, I'm going to open up my study for participants, and I'm going to have this many slots available for men and this many slots available for women. And I'm going to run my study until I fill those slots in. And that systematic sampling will give me a profile that closely matches the population on the characteristics I choose to look at. That has some of its own problems, but I can talk about that a little bit later. Cluster sampling is a second technique where I'm going to be interested in sampling inside of organizations. So the organizations are quite frequently schools. And I might say, I know I've got 50 schools in the particular area I'm looking at. I'm going to put 5 that will be in my study. Multi-stage sampling is where I'm going to take my population, but then inside of that population, I'm going to test a few more people. So I might say, I'm going to identify a target school, and then inside of that school, I'm going to identify a classroom. Then stratified random sampling is over here. That is, I'm going to look at, it's a little bit like that clustering and systematic sampling that I was talking about. Oversampling happens when, for reasons of statistical power, I want to make sure I have enough people. For example, first-generation students, members of minority, are traditionally underrepresented in research. They may be underrepresented in the population, but it's very important that we know about the results of our study and whether they apply to minorities or other disadvantaged populations. Well, you can't just go in and do random sampling, because at the end of the day, you're not going to have enough people in those groups to really know whether or not they generalize to the population. So, so if I do a study to say, oh, Black respondents encounter this situation completely differently. It's hand waved a lot in grant applications because people really, really want the money. But if you're going to attend to issues of fairness, it's important to maybe consider oversampling in your study. Well, again, that's a little bit of a trade-off, because now that you've oversampled in that population, are you going to be generalizing? Is the absolute mean from your study going to be exactly what you want, because it's not going to reflect your sample? So it's also possible to, combine the techniques. And this is kind of a, let's see if I can make this bigger. This is kind of a pull everything together type thing. I can do population of interest, and I can do non-probability sampling. Well, I can have a leading sample. I can do quota sampling. I can do purposive sample. Oh, I have not talked about snowball sampling. Snowball sampling happens, generally speaking, when you're looking at populations that are relatively small and who may have connections to other individuals who have like characteristics. So, for example, my younger sister has multiple sclerosis. And she said, well, oddly enough, in the accounting place where I work, 5 of us have it. Well, people with MS tend to know other people with MS. People with MS also tend to have similar doctors. So if you're recruiting for a target population, like people who have MS, you might want to say, great that you're in our study, do you know anybody else? And get referrals from them. Well, at that point, that's all kinds of non-probability sampling, because it's just the network of people who have that condition. But if your primary problem is to identify people who are in that group, snowball sampling can be pretty effective. And I think we've covered all of these before. So this is kind of a nice figure that gives us the overall picture of what we're doing. Random sampling, this is one I put in because people get a little bit confused about the terms. Random sampling is a different thing than random assignment. And we talked about random assignment, that's flipping a coin and putting people into conditions. And random sampling is trying to get a population that in some way reflects, a sample that in some way reflects the population of people we have. Random assignment is going to increase our internal validity. That is, if 2 variables are associated and I randomly assign them to one of the groups, I know that I can look at that variable as perhaps causing the other variable, because there's nothing about random assignment that people had an equal chance of being in there. I don't have a third variable explanation for my particular model or relationship. If I did not randomly assign, I could say, well, maybe the people who like to lose weight opted to go into the treatment group, and the people who are not so enthused about that said, okay, the control group is fine for me. Sign, that level of enthusiasm or motivation is removed from my model, and the association I have is probably a treatment effect. Random sampling is going to be looking at external validity. So at the end of the day, I can do my study, it can be internally valid, but the numbers of people I have may not generalize to the population I have. So it's a bit of a trade-off between the two. But like I was saying, on tests and in writing, they tend to get these 2 terms confused. For that reason, questions about that? Sometimes it's okay to look at your unrepresentative sampling. Well, I think I talked about that. How are you going to make a decision? You want to do an experiment. generalizes to the population at the zoo. If, on the other hand, you're interested in looking at, is there a relationship between this variable and that variable, period, then maybe internal validity is more important. So talk a little bit about that, and in terms of just vocabulary, if you're looking at internal validity, you probably may not want a random sample. Say you're interested in looking at the ability level of students and their academic motivation. Well, if you do a random sample, that's going to give you one answer. But if you go in and look at only populations of low ability students and high ability students, those two extreme groups, and relate that to motivation, you are far more likely to find an association going. Similarly, if you look at only the middle of this, you're less likely to find it. So I know I should be not drawing on the board, but if you think about things in terms of a scatter plot, if I look at extreme groups here and extreme groups here, and I draw 100 people, I'm darn sure going to get a very nice relationship. If I look at only the middle here, well, if I blow this up, that's going to look a lot less like a relationship going on, because it's going to look a little bit closer to a zero correlation, because I kind of restricted the range to very little variation on the X variable. Well, in experimental design, these extreme groups design are frequently done if we're looking at the exploratory arm of our inquiry. So in industry, or if you're using your psychological training to work on quality control, very frequently we look at lots of variables that we think might be related, and we only look at extreme values for that finding first of where does there seem to be an association going on here. And then we follow that up with, okay, now that we know what the extreme relationships might possibly be, let's follow this up with a study of just those variables that we identified in the stage. And the reason we do that is maybe the actual functional relationship, that is the relationship of the predictor to the criterion, is not going to be a straight line. If I'm only looking at really, really low groups and really, really high groups, yeah, there might be a straight line there. Maybe the relationship is a curve of some sort. And I'm only going to find that information if I've got the full range to take a look. For research studies, non-probability samples in the real world also are examining particular characteristics. So if I want to go in and look at, say, the characteristics of sex offenders with my little map and where they're geolocated, that's probably a very atypical sample. First of all, sex offenders are not typical people. And secondly, even if they were typical people, and you say, well, I'm just studying sex offenders, the sex offenders in Missouri are probably quite different than the sex offenders in, say, in California or other states where the population demographics are possibly different. Sampling technique, not sample size, determines whether we can get validity. And this is a mistake that graduate students and faculty sometimes make. I've got lots and lots of people. Of course, my study is great. I've got a few thousand. But if it's biased, we can't really conclude anything. If we're but at the end of the day, we don't really know whether that number is off, because if it wasn't a random sample, maybe that population differs. The people I looked at differs from the root population that I really want to be studying. All right, I see we're at that time.